Biographical Bytes from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories number 51 for mid-December 2025. Minstrels, Mummers, and Laurel Hill.
That are covered with corn. Who are these days at peace? Who are these days at peace? Who are these days at peace? Who are these days at peace?
Welcome to the mid-December 2025 51st episode of Biographical Bytes from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, an historic and active cemetery in Bala, Pennsylvania. I am Dr. Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine from Temple University, amateur historian, volunteer tour guide, and volunteer podcaster. I'm recording this in mid-December of 2025. Laurel Hill West opened in 1869 across the river from its sister cemetery, Laurel Hill East in Philadelphia. It is more than twice as big as Laurel Hill East. It has a totally different feel, a strikingly different population. Laurel Hill East I think of as a Victorian cemetery associated with the Civil War. Laurel Hill West is more of an Edwardian cemetery associated with the Great War. However, like Laurel Hill East, it is open 365 days a year, now from 7 a.m. until 5 p.m. Plenty of parking at the business office just off Belmont Avenue or at the conservatory and bell tower. If you come in from Belmont, just follow the road past the second gate. There's a white line in the middle. Another possibility is to come in while you're walking the Kinwood Trail. This month's Biographical Bytes from Bala is about two forms of entertainment in which Philadelphia excelled: minstrelsy and mummery. Dozens of minstrel troupes performed in the city, and many made their home in the Quaker City. The biggest name in minstrelsy was no doubt Carncross and Dixey. The former is at Laurel Hill West, the latter at East. Along with the last man to keep a minstrel theater open in Philadelphia, in fact in the United States, Frank Dumont. And not at Laurel Hill, but essential to the understanding of the music of this time is James A. Bland, finest of the African-American minstrel composers, who wrote the song that became the theme song for the Mummers. Let's get started. Part 1. Mummers, Minstrels, and Laurel Hill. Throughout history, people have gathered to share ideas, entertain, and express themselves publicly. From storytelling and dance to music and rituals, performance has always been central to human experience. Entertainment originally stemmed from religious and ritual practices, but these sacred activities that linked communities to the divine eventually gave rise to a variety of genres, including those for amusement, satire, and social commentary. The oldest evidence of human performance is found in prehistoric cave paintings, such as those in Lascaux, France, and Altamira, Spain. They date back more than 17,000 years, and these artworks depict hunting, dancing, and ritual scenes. They suggest that early humans engaged in communal activities that involve performance elements. Anthropologists believe early gatherings included music, chanting, and dance used to communicate with spirits or ensure successful hunts, all activities that required participants to perform before an audience of their peers. The discovery of ancient musical instruments, including bone flutes from the Paleolithic era over 40,000 years ago, highlights the importance of music in early human societies. Playing instruments or singing would naturally attract an audience and foster a sense of community and shared enjoyment. Dance, one of the oldest forms of performance, is evidenced by rhythmic movement and group dances practiced by ancient societies across the globe. Oral storytelling predates written language and served as a primary way to preserve knowledge and culture. Storytellers would engage audiences around fires, reciting tales of heroes, legends, and history, using voice and gesture, an early form of dramatic performance. Many ancient cultures developed elaborate rituals and ceremonies that involved performance. Burial sites from the Upper Paleolithic period reveal ritualistic behavior, such as the use of costumes, masks, jewelry, body paint. As societies became more sophisticated, these performances evolved into formalized traditions. The earliest records of organized theater comes from ancient Egypt, about 2500 BCE, where religious dramas honored gods and recounted mythological stories. Ancient Greek theater, which became a central part of civic life, has roots that extend even further into prehistory. Mummers and mummery have a rich history that spans centuries and cultures. The term mummers refers to performers. Mummery, of course, denotes the tradition of performing masked plays. The roots of mummery trace back to ancient pagan festivals and are evolved over time into various forms of folk entertainment and community celebration. The practice originated in pre-Christian times. It was often linked to rites and festivals that marked season changes. Early societies held winter celebrations that featured costume performances symbolizing death and rebirth cycles, meant to ensure fertility, good harvests, the return of the sun. These performances typically involved masks, disguises, and play acting, which allowed participants to embody spirits or mythological characters. By the Middle Ages, mumming became a popular folk drama throughout Europe, especially in England, Ireland, and Scandinavia. During Christmas and other festive occasions, masked mummers performed short plays in homes, inns, and public spaces. Common themes included good versus evil, death and resurrection, and comic and satirical skits. Performers were often rewarded with food, drink, or small gifts for their entertainment. This tradition continues to this day in Ireland as groups of wren boys or mummers go from house to house on St. Stephen's Day, day after Christmas, where they sing carols, play music, and may perform short skits or dances, often in exchange for food, drink, or small donations. Mummers distinguish themselves from other entertainers through their emphasis on disguise and anonymity. Masks, costumes, altered voices were essential, created a temporary suspension of social norms where performers could mock authority, address taboo topics, and bring joy and laughter to their communities. The mummers' play became a recognized tradition in England and Ireland, typically performed around Christmas, New Year, or Plough Monday. Plough Monday is the first Monday after the Epiphany. These plays featured regular characters: St. George, the Doctor, the Turkish Knight. The plots centered on a hero who is slain and then revived. The performances blended slapstick humor, verse, music, rhyme. And although this tradition declined in some areas during the 19th century and early 20th centuries, mummery has seen a revival in recent decades and remained parts of festivals and parades worldwide. A prominent example, Philadelphia Mummers Parade, held each New Year's Day. This event features elaborate costumes, music, performances, groups competing for recognition, prizes. By 1901, mummery had become an official citywide tradition in Philadelphia. It was organized into divisions: the comics, the fancies, the string bands, the fancy brigades. There used to be shooters and noisemakers. They were eliminated many, many years ago. If you live in Philadelphia, you know that mummery is more than just a parade. It is a community, a tightly knit community of families and friends who pass these traditions down through generations. The culture has faced criticism over the years, including concerns about inclusivity and cultural sensitivity. Recent efforts have aimed to make the event more welcoming and representative of Philadelphia's diverse population. The once exclusively all-white male mummer clubs now actively recruit women and members of diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. Some clubs now feature women in leadership roles and as prominent performers. The mummers community has made efforts to welcome LGBTQ+ participants, including the formation of troops specifically representing LGBTQ+ pride and the inclusion of openly LGBTQ+ performers in many clubs. The parade has implemented rules that ban offensive costumes and performances. These changes aim to ensure that the event is welcoming and respectful of all communities. A visit to the Mummer Museum on South 2 Street near Washington is worth an hour or two of your time. The mummery culture has left a lasting mark on Philadelphia. It symbolizes the city's spirit of celebration, creativity, and resilience. The parade is an opportunity for Philadelphians to come together, showcase their talents, ring in the new year with joy, spectacle. Today, mummery continues to evolve. It reflects both tradition and modern values. The word minstrel has changed significantly over the centuries. Originally, it described wandering musicians in medieval Europe. But by the 19th century, it became associated with American minstrel shows, reflecting broader societal and cultural shifts. In medieval Europe, minstrels were traveling performers. They entertained with music, poetry, storytelling. They were in courts, they went to villages, marketplaces. They functioned as news bearers. They shared stories, legends, and songs, and they played instruments like the lute or the harp or the flute. The term minstrel comes from the Old French ménestrel, which means servant or entertainer, and it is related to troubadours and jongleurs. Now, troubadours were distinct from minstrels. They were poet-musicians who flourished in the courts of southern France between the 11th and 13th centuries. Often nobles or closely linked to noble courts, troubadours' poetry centered on courtly love, chivalry, refined manners. As entertainment became more formalized with the advent of opera, theater, orchestras, the prominence of minstrels declined, and by the 18th century, minstrel evoked nostalgia for a bygone era. Pantomime, or panto, is a form of musical comedy theater especially popular around Christmas. It features slapstick humor, cross-dressing, audience participation, the retelling of fairy tales or folk stories with exaggerated characters, comedic routines, songs, and dance. All three traditions, mummery, minstrelsy, and pantomime, share roots in folk entertainment and community celebration. Mummery and panto are based on local legends and stories, while minstrelsy draws from folk music and oral tradition. Mummers and panto performers engage heavily with audiences. Minstrels often adapted their performances based on the crowd. While mummery is defined by masks and costumes, and panto by cross-dressing and flamboyant costumes, minstrels sometimes adopted characters but focused less on disguise. Each form combines music, drama, and comedy. Minstrelsy emphasizes song and verse, mummery features dramatic comic scenes, and panto offers full theatrical shows. Mummery and panto are tied to festivals like Christmas. Minstrelsy appears at celebrations throughout the year. Together, these traditions influenced vaudeville, an eclectic format that also incorporated acts from burlesque, circus, magic shows, melodrama, opera, ballet, and even scientific lectures. offering audiences a sequence of unrelated performances. Think of the old TV variety show, The Ed Sullivan Show. This was what vaudeville was all about. In the early 19th century United States, minstrel reemerged with a new meaning, the minstrel show. These theatrical performances featured white actors in blackface makeup who caricatured African American people through music, comedy, and skits. While drawing from folk songs and dances and appropriating elements of African American culture, these shows represented stereotyped and derogatory portrayals. Blackface performances began as early as the 1600s with Shakespeare's Othello. Black actors were prohibited from appearing on stage in Europe, so a white actor had to black up. In America, the first known blackface performance occurred 1769 when Lewis Hallam Jr. played a drunken black man in The Padlock in New York City. By the 1810s, the localized versions of the blackface clown became popular. Following the War of 1812, as Americans sought to distinguish themselves from Europeans, blackface minstrelsy grew in popularity. Now, there was some blackface minstrelsy in Britain and parts of Europe, but it never caught on like it did in the United States. Minstrelsy, blackface minstrelsy, is an American invention. Charles Matthews is considered the father of American minstrelsy. In 1822, he toured southern slave states with a one-man minstrel show, and he invented the pun-filled stump speech after he heard a southern preacher. Minstrel shows were initially regarded as unsophisticated, so they were banned in many theaters. But the economic downturn of 1837 led even prestigious venues to stage them because they were affordable entertainment. As abolitionist movements intensified, these shows became popular in the North, where they would portray romanticized, or at times critical, depictions of Southern slave life. Some productions which showed the harsh realities of slavery were banned in the South. As the Civil War approached, efforts were made to present enslaved individuals as content and simple in order to reinforce false narratives about slavery. It was a group out of New York called Christie's Minstrels who formalized the minstrel show into a three-act structure. The first act featured music, witty exchanges between the middleman or the interlocutor, nowadays we'd call him the master of ceremonies, and comic endmen who were named for their position in the semicircle of performers. These conversations evolved into routines with Mr. Tambo and Mr. Bones. They were named for the instruments that they played. Bones were rib bones, animal rib bones, which with practice can be used as castanets. The second act was typically a theatrical parody, like Uncle Tom's Cabin, or maybe a dance performance with guest artists. And then the third act, the final act, it opened with a pun-laden stump speech or a sermon. It ended with a musical number that involved all performers, the so-called grand finale. You see elements of this structure in modern variety and talk shows. You have the opening monologue, musical performances, the host bandleader exchanges, just like the interlocutor and the endmen. Imagine Saturday Night Live or The Tonight Show as a logical extension of the minstrel show format. You'll see what I'm talking about. Music was central to minstrel shows. For many white Northerners, these performances were their only exposure to black Southern culture, although it was a very skewed and unrealistic one. Minstrel shows popularized simple instruments like the banjo, the tambourine, and bones, which are all drawn from Black American culture. Many melodies, lyrics, and song structures were adapted from slave spirituals and African American traditions. Unfortunately, the shows also perpetuated negative stereotypes. They generally presented African Americans as lazy, superstitious, and happy-go-lucky. Common themes included caricatured depictions of slave life and humorous takes on mistreatment. Composer Stephen Foster wrote many songs featured in blackface minstrel shows. While his earlier works included dialect and stereotypes, his later songs moved away from ridicule and caricature, actually offered more sentimental portrayals that appealed to audiences. Now, despite Stephen Foster's predominance of Southern themes, he was from Western Pennsylvania. The man only visited the South once in his life, and that was when he was on a honeymoon. Now, some songs that began as minstrel melodies, especially "O Dem Golden Slippers," became associated with the Mummers. Many of them were written by James Bland, a black minstrel and composer who is interred in non-Laurel Hill West Bala Kinwood, Marion Memorial Park it's called. Part 4 of today's podcast will be about Jimmy Bland. Most historians and social critics maintain that prior to the 1850s, white Americans generally accepted the Southern perspective, which portrayed black enslaved individuals as content with their circumstances. This view suggested that they benefited from plantation life. They preferred their situation over assuming the responsibilities borne by white individuals. Minstrelsy just reinforced this perspective. It staged a grand plantation show that portrayed enslaved people as cheerful and content, rarely showed any unhappiness or desire for freedom. No. The idyllic portrait of plantation life served the Southern pro-slavery interests, but it also served interests of Northerners, who comprised the largest audience for minstrel shows, and they were really none too anxious to have hordes of free blacks migrating to their urban communities. Even those whites who may have been ideologically opposed to the concept of slavery, but were uninformed about the actual conditions of slaves, were influenced. The myth of the happy-go-lucky servant justified adopting a hands-off attitude toward a practice they may have morally condemned. One particularly offensive aspect of minstrelsy is the use of blackface English, an exaggerated stereotyped dialect used by white performers in blackface. This involved phonetic spelling and grammar errors, such as "I's gwine to de store," I'm going to the store, or "That's de way," that's the way. Altered pronouns and verbs like I's, you's, wins. Stock comic lines. "Massa, I's so hungry I could eat a mule," and "Don't you worry none, I fix it good." The use of dees, dem, does, for these, them, and those was common. This caricatured speech persisted into the 20th century through radio shows like Amos and Andy, where white actors imitated so-called black accents in a form of oral blackface. It is important to note, this language was a fabrication. It was used only by those imitating what they thought were the speech patterns of uneducated black people. No one ever really spoke like this on a day-to-day basis. Dance was also a significant part of minstrel shows. The cakewalk, for example, originated as a dance by enslaved people, imitating their white owners, holding competitions where the winner received a cake. Minstrel performers later appropriated and exaggerated those dances. Whether the white folks ever picked up on the mockery is not clear. Black performers, when later allowed, were often directed to make their dance more authentic by exaggerating their movements. Slaves were often restricted to dances where their feet did not cross each other or leave the ground, as some moves were sometimes considered by enslavers as rebellious or expressive of autonomy. This led to the development of unique dance styles that complied with these constraints, but still retained rhythm, style, and expression. Imagine you have to invent a whole new dance style where your feet never leave the ground and one foot never crosses in front of the other one. William Henry Lane, also known as Master Juba, combined African-American and Irish immigrant dance traditions with an emphasis on footwork. He is widely considered the father of tap dancing. Lane and John Diamond, a white dancer, both worked with minstrel troupes and had dance-offs in the 1840s that drew from African, Irish, and English dance traditions. Diamond sometimes would perform these dance-offs in blackface, but sometimes he did not, so it was a black man and a white man competing in tap dancing. Minstrel shows developed standard characters: Jim Crow, Sambo, Zip Coon. These legacies have been extensively analyzed by scholars. Another recurring figure is the wench, a character presented in mummery, minstrelsy, and pantomime, typically played by a cross-dressing man. In mummery, the wench is boisterous, flirtatious, comedic. She offers comic relief and satire. In minstrelsy, the wench was loud, the subject of ridicule, embodying both racial and gender stereotypes. In pantomime, the wench appears as the pantomime dame, a comedic female role played by a man, often loud, brash, physically expressive with outrageous costumes. So there's a lot of crossover. By the 1840s, minstrel shows had become one of Philadelphia's most prominent forms of entertainment. Theaters and opera houses, such as the Arch Street Opera House and the Chestnut Street Theater, regularly staged minstrel acts that drew diverse audiences. Shows featured banjo and fiddle music, songs like Dixey and Old Folks at Home, comedic routines such as the end-man dialogues in the preacher's sermons and the stump speeches. In addition to targeting black people, minstrel shows lampooned politicians, celebrities, current events, other minorities. Irish, Italian, Native American groups also came under their withering gaze. You ever heard of Calico Indians? The Calico Indians are a theatrical invention rather than a real tribe. They were used for comedic and musical acts. The legacy of minstrelsy is complex. There is no doubt that it contributed to the development of American music and theater, but it also perpetuated harmful racial stereotypes. Modern scholarship acknowledges both the artistic influence and the problematic aspects of this tradition. I am recording this late in 2025. I am 78 years old. I grew up in Park Forest, a white suburb of Chicago. There was not a black family in that community until the population was well over 20,000. I was raised a Roman Catholic. Our parish was the all-white St. Irenaeus. It was named for a Greek bishop from the 2nd century A.D. I remember the stir when a black priest visited unannounced and celebrated Mass for our all-white congregation. His Latin was in a strange accent. At the sermon, he explained that he was from Liberia. He had been named for the saint. He was on a pilgrimage in the United States and wanted to say Mass in every church that was named for him while he was here. When I graduated from Marion Catholic High School in 1965, there were 2 black students in the entire school of about 800. And this is a high school that was in a community that was 15 to 20% African American, Chicago Heights, Illinois. From the late 1940s until the late 1950s, St. Irenaeus Parish annual fundraiser was a minstrel show. 6 white men performing in blackface and using the stereotypical blackface accent. My father was an end man, and my mother played a wench, and she choreographed. My father wrote the scripts. One year he even let me write a few of the jokes. Now, to involve as many parish members as possible, they had expanded to 8 end men: asparagus, beet, carrot, I think, it might have been cabbage, dill, endive, and fig. It was the classic format. Singing, dancing, joke-telling, hair-pulling. I remember one night when a wench pulled the woolly black wig off an end man's scalp. I'm pretty sure it was her husband. And it exposed his bright red hair incongruously paired with the black makeup. Around 1960, after a visit from members of the Chicago Heights chapter of the NAACP, the parish was strongly encouraged to change the show's format. The theme was circus the following year. The same performers. They became clowns. They were in whiteface. The show was a total failure, and the year after that, the minstrel show fundraiser was discontinued. I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of people across the United States who could tell a story that's very, very similar to mine. The remainder of this podcast is going to focus on three individuals. John Carncross of Laurel Hill West. He was co-owner of the famed Carncross and Dixey troupe. Frank Dumont, interred at Laurel Hill East, was a performer and the man who literally wrote the book about minstrel performance, the Whitmark Amateur Minstrel Guide and Burnt Cork Encyclopedia. And then somebody not at Laurel Hill, James Jimmy Bland, the black minstrel composer. He's interred in Bala. His songs remain associated with both minstrel shows and the mummers. So let's get started. Part 2, John Carncross, 1832-1911, and E.F. Dixey, 1833-1904, two fathers of modern minstrelsy. Black is the result of the absence or absorption of visible light. Technically, black is not a color. It's the lack of all colors. In pigment, you can create black by combining multiple colors until light is fully absorbed. Now, these physical properties are neutral. They do not carry inherent value or meaning of good or bad. Biases associated with the color black primarily arise from cultural, historical, and social factors, rather than inherent qualities of the color itself. Various societies have attributed symbolic meanings to black, such as darkness, mystery, mourning, power, elegance. In many Western cultures, black is linked to grief and mourning, but in the fashion industry, it's esteemed for its sophistication, timelessness, versatility. In some cultures, black does hold positive or sacred meanings. In ancient Egypt, black was associated with fertility. The rich soil of the Nile symbolizes life and rebirth. Thus, the symbolism of black is not universal and is subject to interpretation based on cultural context. Psychologically, humans often associate darkness and, by extension, the color black with the unknown, which can provoke fear or caution. This association can influence attitudes and language, leading to expressions such as black mood for sadness or depression, or blacklist, blackball for exclusion. Over time, repeated negative associations can contribute to implicit or explicit bias against the color black in certain contexts. Terms like black sheep, an outcast, a black mark, a negative record, carry a negative connotation. These linguistic patterns are a result of metaphorical usage and cultural evolution rather than an intrinsic quality of the color itself. The human brain processes all visual stimuli, including skin tone, in the visual cortex. Just as it does with color in objects and environments, the brain detects the tone, contrast, and context of skin shades. But skin color perception is not just a biological process. It is also profoundly influenced by learned associations, cultural context, and individual experience. Unlike pure colors, skin tones are perceived in social contexts, which can activate areas of the brain linked with emotion, recognition, and even threat detection, depending on ingrained attitudes or societal cues. Pigmentocracy, the ranking of individuals according to skin color, is not an innate feature of human nature. Throughout history, pigmentocracy has been reinforced by systems of colonialism, slavery, and social policy, which have tied lighter skin to higher status and opportunity, and darker skin to marginalization. I talked at length about pigmentocracy in the black population in Biographical Bytes from Bala, Laurel Hill, West Stories number 30, Black is Beautiful. There is no inherent neural threshold at which skin tone triggers a negative response in a healthy human brain. Instead, what can happen is that social conditioning through media, history, and culture may teach individuals to associate certain skin tones with specific qualities or stereotypes. These associations are learned. They are not hardwired, and they can vary drastically across cultures and historical periods. The transition in perception is not due to the shade itself, but to the meanings that society has attached to it. Now, the context in which skin tone is perceived significantly affects neural and emotional responses. Encounters in familiar, friendly settings are less likely to elicit problematic reactions regardless of skin shade. Conversely, unfamiliar or biased environments may prime individuals to respond differently, especially if certain skin tones have been stigmatized. This shows that the brain's reaction is not dictated by the darkness of the tone, but by context and learned belief systems. For millennia, people have adapted the dress, language, and customs of other ethnic groups for diverse reasons, including entertainment, social mobility, espionage, and assimilation or passing. In ancient societies, impersonation was sometimes employed in theaters or rituals, but those acts rarely involved the systematic caricaturing of ethnic groups that became commonplace in later centuries. Blackface has appeared in contexts that are not explicitly racial in nature. In certain theatrical traditions, blackface has been used as a means of dramatic effect rather than racial impersonation. For example, in some forms of European theater, actors would use black grease paint or soot to create a sense of anonymity, or to represent non-human characters such as demons, ghosts, or fantastical creatures. The intention here was not to mimic a particular racial group, but to create a visual distinction or disguise for the performer. Blackface has occasionally appeared in masquerade balls and carnival celebrations, where participants use face paint to create a variety of characters. In these contexts, blackface might be used as part of a costume of a chimney sweep, a devil, or other figures associated with darkness or mystery. Again, the use is not directly connected to racial impersonation, but rather to the symbolism of the color and the character being portrayed. In contexts outside of entertainment, the application of black or dark face paint can serve practical purposes. In the military, hunters, other individuals involved in covert operations may use black paint as camouflage to minimize their visibility during nighttime activities. In these circumstances, the intent is strictly functional, to achieve concealment within the environment rather than to depict any specific ethnicity. In some cultures, blackening the face is part of ritualistic practices or traditional ceremonies. In certain folk festivals or religious observances, participants may apply black paint to signify mourning, transformation, to invoke supernatural powers. The symbolism is often tied to cultural beliefs about darkness, protection, or the spirit world, rather than to race. The Dutch Black Peter, Sinterklaas's companion, has dark features, dark complexions, because he's the one who delivers the gifts through the chimney. In Central European folklore, Krampus, a horned, dark-furred figure associated with Christmas. He's depicted this way to highlight his menacing presence and contrast him with the brightly dressed St. Nicholas. But despite these exceptions, there is no doubt about what was meant when a white man painted his features black for the sole purpose of mocking an entire group of people. Philadelphia in the 18th century was among the most tolerant and cosmopolitan cities in the Atlantic world. In his 1701 Charter of Privileges, William Penn granted religious freedom to all settlers in the colony of Pennsylvania, provided they worshipped, quote, one almighty God, end quote. In the wake of Penn's charter, Catholics, Jews, and members of persecuted Protestant sects like the Amish, Moravians, and Mennonites sought refuge in and around Philadelphia, and the Quakers of the Quaker City soon found themselves in the minority. In 1780, they still had enough political clout to push an act for the gradual abolition of slavery through the state legislature, which made Pennsylvania the first state in the country to adopt such a law. The belief in racial superiority stemmed from polygenism, the flawed theory that humanity is divided into separate races with inherent differences in intelligence, morality, and value. Groups were mainly classified by what could be easily seen: skin color, Caucasian, white; Mongolian, yellow; Ethiopian, black; American, red; and Malayan, brown. In the 18th and 19th century, many white people just assumed that they were superior, and they started with this premise and used this idea to justify practices like slavery, segregation, colonization, and oppression because they were supported by cultural narratives, laws, and pseudo-scientific claims of the ranking in color. So-called scientific racism refers to the misuse of science to support or justify racist beliefs and policies. In the 19th century, some scientists tried to use measurements of skulls, brains, and other physical characteristics to prove the superiority of certain groups over others. These studies were deeply flawed. They were biased. They have been thoroughly discredited by modern science. I talked about Dr. Samuel George Morton back in All Bones Considered Laurel Hill Stories number 28, Bad Science. To recap, Morton, buried at Laurel Hill East, was a respected Philadelphia physician and natural scientist who collected and measured hundreds of human skulls from around the world to try and correlate cranial capacity with intellectual ability. He concluded that, surprise, white people, specifically people of European descent, had larger skulls and, by this reasoning, greater intelligence than people of African, Asian, or indigenous descent. Morton's work was frequently referenced throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries as purported evidence for white superiority and the notion of a national racial hierarchy. His research was employed to present a, quote, scientific rationale, end quote, for slavery and policies that marginalized non-white populations. Proponents of these practices often cited Morton to defend their actions. Nonetheless, Morton's methodology suffered from significant shortcomings. He selectively incorporated data. He disregarded conflicting information. He allowed personal biases to influence his findings. He accepted specimens without verifying their provenance. Subsequent scientific inquiry has established that cranial capacity is not linked to intelligence and revealed that Morton's measurements lacked consistency and objectivity. Unfortunately, Morton's ideas were picked up and expanded by other scientists and writers in the United States and Europe throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, and scientific racism became embedded in academic, medical, and social institutions. These theories were used to justify policies such as slavery, segregation, colonialism, and eugenics programs. The eugenics movement, which emerged in the late 19th century, was particularly influential and promoted selective breeding to improve the human race. Now, when the Nazi Party rose to power in Germany in the 1930s, its leaders adopted and expanded on these existing theories of racial hierarchy. Nazi ideology held that the Aryan race was superior, and that Jews, Roma, Slavs, and other groups were inferior, dangerous, or even non-human. The Nazis implemented policies based on these beliefs, which led to the Holocaust and other atrocities. Where does this word Aryan come from? It originally referred to a group of ancient people who spoke the Proto-Indo-Iranian language. It was a self-designation that was used by these people, particularly in a region that is now Iran and northern India. So in this context, Aryan simply meant noble or honorable in Sanskrit and related languages. But in the 19th century, European scholars used Aryan to describe the Indo-European language family and its speakers as a linguistic and cultural, not a racial category. The term referred to people across Europe and Asia with shared language roots rather than specific physical traits. Aryan was wrongly used by racists in Europe to mean the Caucasian race, especially Northern Europeans. The Nazis further claimed a pure Aryan race was superior, but this idea lacked scientific support. It's been rejected by modern scholars. Samuel Morton's magnum opus, Crania Americana, was published in 1839, just after Pennsylvania revoked the right of black citizens to vote. Yes, you heard that correctly. Prior to 1838, Pennsylvania's voting laws did not explicitly exclude African American men. Under that original Pennsylvania Constitution of 1790, the right to vote was granted to free men, a term that was interpreted to include free black men who met property and residency requirements, 2 years in the state, 1 year in the district. As a result, free African American men in Pennsylvania were able to vote in elections, and historical records confirm that some did participate in the electoral process during that period from 1790 to 1838. The 1838 constitutional change marked a significant regression in civil rights for African Americans in Pennsylvania. It stripped away a right they had previously exercised, and it was not until after the Civil War and the passage of the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1870 that African American men regained the legal right to vote in Pennsylvania and across the country, 32 years after they had lost that right. By 1840, Philadelphia was home to one of the largest free black populations in the United States. Among its estimated 220,000 residents were 15,000 African Americans. English and Welsh descendants of the original Quaker and Anglican settlers numbered about 80,000. Germans accounted for about 40,000. There were some pre-famine Irish, about 30,000, but that number was rising rapidly. And other Europeans made up most of the remaining population. Native Americans had pretty much been pushed out of the city by that time. So, 15,000 African Americans in Philadelphia in 1840. This was a vibrant community with churches, schools, social clubs, and mutual aid societies that provided support, fostered a sense of unity. Since they were shunned by white society, they just created their own. Institutions like the African Methodist Episcopal Church played a central role and offered not only spiritual guidance, but organized social events and political activities. Despite these community strengths, freed black men still faced prejudice and exclusion. Segregation was the rule. Social interactions with white Philadelphians were limited. African Americans formed their own neighborhoods, such as the area around 7th and Lombard Streets, which became a hub of black culture and social life. Employment options for freed black men were limited by racial discrimination. Most worked as laborers, porters, or in service jobs. Only a few were able to establish themselves as skilled tradesmen or entrepreneurs. White-owned businesses often refused to hire African Americans, and those who did work were typically paid less than their white counterparts. Nonetheless, some black Philadelphians managed to achieve economic success. They opened barber shops, restaurants, small businesses that served the African American community. And the existence of mutual aid societies helped members save money, find housing, and protect each other from legal or financial troubles. Freed black men in Philadelphia were politically active. They fought for civil rights and abolition. They attended meetings, signed petitions, participated in protests against discriminatory laws and practices. The city was a center for abolitionist activity, with black leaders working alongside white allies to promote anti-slavery causes and challenge the injustices of the era. Freed black men often faced violence and threats from groups opposed to their rights, such as during the infamous race riots that periodically erupted in the city, like the torching of Pennsylvania Hall 4 days after it opened in 1838, or the assassination of activist Octavius Cato on Election Day in 1871. Education was highly valued in the free black community. Since public schools were often closed to black children, African Americans established their own schools and educational societies. Literacy rates among black Philadelphians were relatively high compared to other cities, which reflected the community's commitment to learning and advancement. Cultural life thrived through churches, music, and social clubs. Newspapers like the Colored American or the Philadelphia Tribune informed and united the community and advocated for rights and celebrated achievements. And when black people entered the city, they could not help but encounter large, colorful caricatures of themselves on theater walls. Bulging eyes, woolly hair, massive bright red lips, pitch black skin. This only reinforced their roles in society, and there were dozens of theaters. Blackface minstrelsy was everywhere. George Christie and Wood's minstrels, not to be confused with Edwin Pierce Christie and his minstrels out of New York, were one of the earliest and most prominent minstrel troupes with a base in the Quaker City. Duprez and Benedict's minstrels, founded by Lou Benedict and Charles H. Duprez, was originally established in Philadelphia. Hooley's minstrels performed extensively in Philadelphia during the mid-19th century, before they relocated to other cities. Other troupes you might encounter: Birch, Wambold, and Bacchus minstrels, Campbell's minstrels, Irwin and Haviland's minstrels, G.B. Woolridge's minstrels, all had a strong presence in the city of brotherly love. But the two names most associated with Philadelphia and minstrelsy were the team of Carncross and Dixey and Frank Dumont. What did black Americans feel about this visual assault? Direct written accounts from black audience members in the 19th century are rare, largely because literacy rates among African Americans were suppressed, and their voices were often excluded from mainstream publications. Some sources do exist, including Frederick Douglass's screed, in which he called performers and audience filthy scum. I will discuss that elsewhere in the podcast. Abolitionist, novelist, playwright, and historian William Wells Brown, one of the first published African-American novelists and playwrights, referenced minstrelsy in his writing. He described how black people felt humiliation and resentment when witnessing their culture and appearance mocked on stage. He also noted that some black attendees went to see what white society thought of them, though they were often pained by the experience. Some black-owned newspapers of the late 19th century, the Colored American, New York Age, published editorials and letters to the editor reacting to minstrel shows. These writings frequently condemn the shows as degrading and offensive and describe black audiences as feeling disgusted or embarrassed by the performances. When John Carncross retired from minstrelsy in 1895, the Harrisburg Telegraph gave him quite a write-up. It is announced that John L. Carncross, the famous minstrel manager, will sever his connection with the amusement enterprise in Philadelphia, which he has conducted for almost a generation. But few men in the Burt Cork profession have done so much for minstrelsy as Mr. Carncross, and his place in Philadelphia is the veritable home of Burt Cork. The announcement of his retirement will be learned with surprise in Harrisburg, as many of our citizens are patrons of the Minstrel Hall in Philadelphia, and to go to Philadelphia without visiting Carncross Place was to some of them a trip devoid of pleasure. It has been many years since John L. Carncross joined the Minstrels, and his career has been a very honorable one. He is a native Harrisburger, as some of the Telegraph readers know, and was born in a house at Front and Chestnut. He had scarcely reached his teens when the family moved to Philadelphia. Sam S. Sanford, the famous minstrel, had a home for Burt Cork Opera at 11th and Market in Philadelphia, and his company comprised the greatest artists in the profession. He heard of Carncross and his wonderful silver tenor voice and engaged him to warble ballads. And how he could sing! At the breaking out of the war, the Sanford Company came to Harrisburg and played a long engagement in Brant's Hall, where the Trust Company building now stands. And how he could sing! At the breaking out of the war, the Sanford Company came to Harrisburg and played a long engagement in Brant's Hall. Carncross was the favorite of the company. His wonderful singing has never been excelled on the minstrel stage. Gossip has seen a great audience turn from the hilarious joke of the end man, almost bursting with laughter, to the ballad of Carncross, and become hushed in an instant. He sang, "Tramp, tramp, the boys are marching," "When you and I were soldier boys," "When this cruel war is over," "Just before the battle, mother," and other sentimental songs of like character, and with such a tender, sweet, pathetic voice as to move the audience to tears. It was often said that if John L. Carncross had taken up the study of operatic music and joined one of the large opera companies, his voice would have won a worldwide name for him, and he would have ranked with Castle, Ira Payne, John N. Arnold, and others who went from the minstrel boards to heavy opera, and whose voices are still remembered with delight. A leap from minstrelsy to opera was apparently not unheard of, but the path would be fraught with challenges. Two totally different types of music. Opera demanded rigorous vocal training, familiarity with European styles, fluency in foreign languages. Minstrelsy emphasized popular appeal, comedic performance. So those who actually made a transition, I have a feeling it was more likely to operetta or musical theater or light opera. They were sort of bridges between the popular entertainment and the more formal opera world. All right, back to the article in the paper. But Carncross was practical. His voice was his fortune, and he joined it with the grotesque humor and bones master of E.F. Dixey. And together they purchased the Sanford Opera House in Philadelphia in 1869, and both made wealth galore. Mr. Dixey retired some years ago to a farm in New Jersey, and now Mr. Carncross, after a career of 36 years in the minstrel business, 27 of which he was manager, retires with all his laurels. For some years he has not appeared in public, but his charming voice he still possesses, albeit he sings very little. John Carncross's partner for much of his career was E. Freeman Dixey, D-I-X-E-Y, whose name was a household word in Philadelphia, where he spent practically his whole career, and a major portion of his life. His first engagement was in Boston when he was 18, but he came to Philadelphia and opened here at Cartier's Lyceum, which was later the site of the 11th Street Opera House. He was with the Julian Serenaders in 1854. Now, E.F. Dixey is a bit of a nuisance to research, and it took me a few days to actually discover that he was buried at Laurel Hill East. He went professionally by E.F. or E. Freeman. I found the beginning E to represent Edmund F. at Findagrave. That's Edmund with a U. Edmund T. at the Laurel Hill online finding tool. Edmund with an O in another site, and then I found other places where he was Edward F, and Edwin F. So, had to do a little bit of searching, but I found him. He's in the South section. Dixey is an English surname. It originates from the British Isles, mainly linked to English heritage. It bears no relation to the Dixey nickname used for the Old South, D-I-X-I-E. That only gained popularity in 1859 after Daniel Decatur Emmett released the song Dixey.
In the land of cotton, old times there, not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. In Dixieland, where I was born in early on one frosty morning. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. Said I wish I was in Dixie, hooray, hooray. In Dixieland I'll take my stand to live and die in Dixie. Away, away, away down south in Dixie. Away, away, away down south in Dixie.
Regarding the term Dixie, two common origins are suggested. One proposes it comes from the French word dix, meaning 10, because in the early 1800s, Louisiana banks produced $10 notes that were labeled Dix. They were called Dixies, so New Orleans became known as the Land of Dixies, and that was later shortened to Dixie and eventually metastasized over the rest of that area. Another theory refers to the Mason-Dixon line, the boundary between Pennsylvania and Maryland, that came to symbolize the divide between the North and the South. The region south of this line was sometimes referred to as Dixie, although north of the line was not referred to as Mason. Both of those theories are not proven, by the way. They sound good, but doesn't prove anything. When Sam Sanford's Opera House opened in Philadelphia in 1855, Dixey was a member of the company. He continued with Sanford until the latter drew away from its management in April of 1862, and that's when Dixey and Carncross opened the theater under the name of Carncross and Dixey's Minstrels. He had other partnerships also. He joined with Frank Moran. That was Moran and Dixey's Minstrels. He retired, but then he came back with Carncross and Dixey's Minstrels. Finally retired to private life in May of 1878. Mr. Dixey was one of minstrelsy's greatest bones players. His earlier days, he also excelled in the portrayal of wenches. He was a gifted, intellectual, cultured man, born in Marblehead, Massachusetts in 1833, and died in Philadelphia in 1904, and he is interred in the south section of Laurel Hill East. John Carncross outlived his partner by 7 years. When he died, several of his friends shared stories about the man that highlighted his life and career. Mr. Carncross made at least 3 fortunes while connected with the Little Playhouse, and on the 3rd occasion he wisely retired from active management. As a matter of fact, he never liked his profession, but each time he made a venture in commercial life, he met with discouragement and was obliged to return to the business in which he had won fame and fortune. Prior to going on stage, Mr. Carncross was in the employ of the Pennsylvania Railroad as a civil engineer. His beautiful tenor voice attracted the attention of Sam Sanford, who made him an offer which was so attractive that the young engineer could not refuse it. And he gained a proud distinction of doing business in a manner beyond reproach. At times he was perhaps a trifle too particular to suit members of his company, but that element is largely responsible for the long life which minstrelsy has enjoyed in this city. He was a strict disciplinarian, was greatly opposed to the use of liquor, but charitable to those who did imbibe, and believe me, he frequently had his own trouble with those fellows. An illustration of his charitable nature was told to me by John Murphy, who joined the Minstrels during the period when pinafore was the rage, around 1878. Murphy and his partner Morton had but recently joined the organization when Murphy had the misfortune to break his ankle while dancing. He persisted in playing through the performance when Mr. Carncross told him to have the injured ankle examined by a physician. Now, remember, this is about 20 years before X-rays were discovered. Murphy did so, and for the next 10 weeks he was compelled to remain in bed. Each Tuesday, an envelope was brought to him containing his salary for the week. At the end of that time, he reported to the Opera House to resume work. But Mr. Carncross called him aside, told him to walk around for 4 or 5 weeks longer so that the ankle would be perfectly healed. When making the spring jaunts, there was nothing too good for members of the company. He looked after their every comfort and took delight in doing so. Now, when I read accounts like this, I'm always baffled about how somebody could earn 2 or 3 fortunes by buying a theater, starting a company with a few dozen actors and stagehands, paying them honestly, and then putting on a show that cost 25 cents for admission, 50 cents if you wanted a box seat, and kids were welcome for 13 cents. That reminds me of the Gilded Age millionaires who made their millions in the trolley business. They made those millions a nickel at a time. The legacy of John Carncross and E.F. Dixey in the era of minstrelsy remains, like America, a paradox. Just as the founding father who composed the words, "All men are created equal," owned more than 600 human beings during his lifetime, minstrelsy was marked by both wildly commercial success and the harsh realities of its societal context. As the curtain eventually fell on the minstrel stage, the echoes of laughter, the bittersweet songs, and the complex interplay of entertainment, prejudice, and community left an indelible impression on Philadelphia's cultural memory. The city's theaters, once vibrant with the sounds of banjo and bones, gradually gave way to new forms of performance, which reflected the shifting attitudes and aspirations of a changing nation. While the fortunes amassed by men like Carncross and Dixey are a testament to the popularity and business acumen of the time, they also stand as a reminder of the stories, voices, and experiences, many marginalized, that shaped and were shaped by this uniquely American art form. In looking back on these lives and their intertwined histories, we are compelled to acknowledge both the achievements and the contradictions of an entertainment tradition that both reflected and reinforced the complexities of its age. Part 3. Frank Dumont, 1848-1911. Gentlemen, be seated. Standardizing minstrelsy. The simple and formulaic recipe for a minstrel show made it easy to perform. A small group of performers relied on stock characters, common jokes, popular songs, and predictable routines. The basic format involved the 3 main parts: the opening Meet the Cast ensemble, an olio of variety acts, and then the concluding burlesque or parody. Now, this made it easy for even amateur troupes to stage a minstrel show with minimal rehearsal or theatrical training. Props, costumes, and sets were straightforward, often just chairs, musical instruments, blackface makeup. This kept production costs low, coordination uncomplicated. The reliance on familiar tropes and recycled materials also meant that anyone with basic performance skills could participate. Minstrelsy soon became middle-class entertainment for many reasons. It provided accessible, affordable amusement. It appealed to a wide audience with its comedic sketches, popular tunes, and lively performances. As urban populations grew and theaters multiplied, minstrel shows adapted to playhouses and opera houses frequented by the middle class. Their content often reflected current events, social trends, and everyday life, making them relatable and enjoyable for the public. The show's humor and music became embedded in mainstream culture, and their performances were seen as family-friendly and respectable, which further cemented their place in middle-class society for decades. Despite all this good that can be claimed for minstrel shows, we must never lose sight of the fact that this popularity was rooted in and perpetuated harmful racial stereotypes, which went largely unchallenged in that era. While white audiences widely attended minstrel shows, many contemporary critics, especially abolitionists, intellectuals, and early civil rights advocates, viewed minstrelsy as deeply offensive and harmful. They recognized that minstrel shows perpetuated negative stereotypes, mocked black culture, and reinforced racist attitudes. Some white critics also expressed discomfort with the crude humor and racial mockery, but their objections were often less about social justice and more about taste, decorum. Black journalists and editors who worked for black newspapers such as the North Star and the Colored American were outspoken in their condemnation of minstrel shows. These publications frequently criticized the way minstrelsy distorted and degraded the image of African Americans, portraying them as lazy, ignorant, or buffoonish. Black journalists and editors argued that these performances contributed to the perpetuation of prejudice and made it more difficult for African Americans to be seen as equals in society. And they pointed out the irony that even as black people were denied access to mainstream artistic opportunities, their culture was taken and mocked on the stage. Frederick Douglass, the renowned abolitionist and writer, was one of the most prominent critics of minstrel shows. In an 1848 issue of the North Star, Douglass referred to blackface performers as, quote, the filthy scum of white society, who have stolen from us a complexion denied to them by nature, in which to make money and pander to the corrupt taste of their white fellow citizens. This quote reflects Douglass's contempt for both the performers and the audiences who supported minstrelsy, as well as his recognition of the harmful impact those shows had on the perception of black Americans. It also showed him ahead of the curve in using the phrase filthy scum. Now, scum has been used as a term of contempt since at least the 16th century. It originally referred to the layer of dirt or froth on a liquid. Later, metaphorically, it meant the lowest or the most worthless part of society. And the word filthy has long been applied to both physical dirt and moral depravity. But other than this use, this isolated use by Douglass, it looks like the combined phrase filthy scum did not really appear in the English language literature and journalism until many years later in the late 19th century. And then it was typically employed in sensationalistic reporting, political rhetoric, or fictional dialogue to emphasize the speaker's disdain. For example, British newspapers and novels from the early 1900s occasionally featured the phrase filthy scum when they described criminal elements or social outcasts. It is really startling to see Douglass's use of that term in 1848. Now, coincidentally, it was in 1848 that Frank Dumont was born in New York to French immigrant parents Francis and Zoraida Monieres Dumont. Zoraida was called Zoe. Frank became one of the most significant figures in the minstrel culture of the late 19th century as a performer, manager, writer, and composer. He began his career as a young boy when he joined a minstrel troupe, and by 1862 he was a member of Christie's Minstrels. Edmund Christie and his company set the standard format for minstrel shows, which remained largely unchanged thereafter. The curtain rises to find the cast arranged in a semicircle. In the center is the interlocutor, or the MC, the middleman. If this role was played by one of the few black men originally allowed to participate in minstrelsy, he would be made up with a white face. At the ends were, well, the end men, at least two, many as up to 6. The two staple characters were Mr. Tambo, who played the tambourine, and Mr. Bones, who rattled the bones. The interlocutor usually wore formal attire. The others in blackface wore gaudy swallow-tailed coats and striped trousers. The program opened with a chorus, often as a grand entrance, and at the conclusion of the song, the interlocutor gave the classic command, "Gentlemen, be seated." Then followed a series of jokes between the interlocutor and end men, interspersed with ballads, comic songs, instrumental numbers, chiefly on the banjo and violin. The second part, or the olio, the mixture or medley, consisted of a series of individual acts that concluded with a hoedown or a walk-around in which every member did a specialty number while the others sang or clapped. And then the third part consisted of a farce, burlesque, or comic opera. Dumont learned his lessons well from his time with Christie, but he left before the end of the season to join Arlington and Doniker's minstrels. Billy Arlington was a minstrel from Chicago who ran several Midwest companies. Now, early in the Civil War, General Ben Butler had coined an unfamiliar word for the minstrels to use, which proved both funny and of interest. To all the black refugees who were flocking to Fortress Monroe, having escaped their masters, he applied the term contrabands of war. Normally, contraband of war encompasses any goods that, if delivered to a belligerent, would enhance its military strength or capacity to wage war, and are therefore subject to seizure by opposing forces during conflict. Newspapers took up this phrase, and the word contraband crept into conversations. Minstrels were quick to attach the word to songs, skits, and speeches. The Happy Contraband, Contraband from Dixey, Contraband's Lament, Contraband Children, Contraband's Adventures, all started to appear on the programs. They furnished subjects for all kinds of songs and dances. It was around 1880 that Frank Dumont relocated to Philadelphia. Here he continued to develop his career locally. He introduced a song, Silver Threads Among the Gold. This was composed by two Wisconsinites. H.P. Danks wrote the music. Eben E. Rexford wrote the lyrics. Rexford earned his living by writing poetry, as well as articles on flowers and gardening for magazines. At age 18, he wrote and sold a piece titled Growing Old for $3. Later, Danks, as the composer of Silver Threads, contacted Rexford to request lyrics for a new song. Rexford revisited and revised Growing Old from his scrapbook to fulfill this request. Now, while he was recounting this experience, Rexford explained that he funded his college education through writing, and it was during this period that Danks offered him $3 per lyric submission. Rexford sent 9 songs. He received $18. He was not told which 6 were accepted or which 3 were declined. So consequently, Rexford was uncertain if Silver Threads Among the Gold was among those for which he was compensated. And if you're still wondering about somebody who worked his way through college by writing song lyrics and poems, $3 a lyric, I read the story of someone else who worked his way through college selling carbon paper on commission. The song for which he had written the lyrics was first performed for Rexford by a group of Oneida Indians at a concert in Shockton, Wisconsin. Its popularity proved remarkable. In 1932, there was a poll done by WABC-AM New York listeners. They selected it as their favorite song, even though it was 60 years old at this time. Silver Threads Among the Gold was the most frequently recorded song of the acoustic recording era. Here it is. The acoustic recording era began with Edison's invention of the phonograph in 1877. It continued until the introduction of electrical recording technology around 1925. The transition to electrical recording marked the end of the acoustic era. Once microphones and electronic amplifiers came and improved the fidelity and the dynamic range of recorded sound. Frank Dumont introduced the song When You and I Were Young Maggie. Lyrics for this classic originated as a poem by Canadian school teacher George Washington Johnson of Hamilton, Ontario. Margaret Maggie Clark, 3 years his junior, was his student and later became his wife. He wrote the verse, published it in an 1864 poetry collection, Maple Leaves. The couple married October 21st, 1864, but Maggie's health declined, and she died May 12, 1865, 7 months after they were married. Composer James Austin Butterfield subsequently set the poem to music, and in 2005, the song When You and I Were Young Maggie was inducted into the Canadian Songwriters Hall of Fame.
I wandered today to the hill, Maggie, to watch the scene below. The creek in the old rusty mill, Maggie, where we set in long, long ago. The green grove is gone from the hill, Maggie, where first the daisies sprung. The old rusty mill is still, Maggie, since you and I were young. They say I am feeble.
Other songs that Dumont claimed to have introduced to the public: The Old Log Cabin in the Lane, The Little Old Church in the Valley. These were sentimental ballads that became staples. It was Dumont's version of The Old Folks at Home, also known as Swanee River, that helped to spread its popularity. Anticipating by a century 2 classic 20th century musical numbers, The Man and the Moon is a Lady from Mame and The Moon and Me from the Addams Family musical, it was Frank who introduced My Sweetheart's The Man in the Moon to the minstrel circuit. Other songs introduced by Frank: The Huckleberry Picnic. Huckleberry as a term of endearment. It actually traces back to the late 19th century. It was popularized through literature because of Mark Twain's classic novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The character Huck Finn was a resourceful, loyal, good-natured, all of these qualities that contributed to the positive connotations of the term Huckleberry. Other songs he introduced: How Do You Do, Aunt Susie? Which Road Is You Gwine to Take? There's that pesky gwine word again. And a personal favorite that my father used to sing: Plant a watermelon seed on my grave and let the juice soak through. This has apparently evolved into a common camp song.
Oh, plant a watermelon on my grave and let the juice run through. Oh, plant a watermelon on my grave, that's all I ask of you. Now, the parson likes fried chicken, and it tastes mighty fine. But all I ask of you is a watermelon vine. So plant a watermelon on my grave and let the juice run through.
1895, Frank purchased the 11th Street Opera House, a venue already known for hosting minstrel shows. The structure was built in 1854 as Dr. Samuel T. Wiley's Presbyterian Church at the corner of 11th and Wrenstead, just south of Market Street. Sam Carty leased it and opened it with a troupe he called Julian's Serenaders and Opera Troupe. He made few changes in the structure of the building. The church choir loft became the theater balcony. Early in 1855, Sam S. Sanford assumed the lease. He called it Sanford's Opera House. He stayed until 1862, when Carncross and Dixey began their career as a permanent institution. Carncross remained there until Dumont assumed the management. By then, the neighborhood had become a mercantile district without much traffic after dark. Dumont looked around for a friendlier venue. He selected the old museum at the corner of 9th and Arch Streets in the Tenderloin district. This structure had been built by Carncross, Dixey, and Simpson for the new home of Carncross and Dixey's Minstrels. They backed out at the last minute. Simpson had to assume control. Beyond his roles as performer and manager, Frank Dumont was a prolific writer. He produced hundreds of skits, plays, and musical shows. I found dozens of his scripts available, downloadable PDFs from archive.org. His 1899 publication, The Whitmark Amateur Minstrel Guide and Burnt Cork Encyclopedia, became the unofficial Bible for amateur and professional minstrel troupes. The book offers scripts, jokes, songs, instructions on staging minstrel shows, instructions on how to do sound effects, what sort of scenery that you're going to need. This all helps standardize the format, made it accessible to even more performers around the country. Dumont's book offered various stories for the minstrels to tell, and they were not all race-based. For example, here's a story that's offered as one to tell on a minstrel stage. In the old days, a gambler by the name of Dupree Dodge was well known to the circus, minstrel, and theatrical fraternity. He was what might be called an Old River skin gambler, depending on marked cards for a sure thing. Now, these cards were marked in a peculiar manner among the ornamental scrolls of the back of the pasteboards. In the hands of a confederate or a victim, old Dodge could always tell what the person held in his hand. Now, it seems that Dodge retired and opened an oyster saloon. Charlie Backus called to see how the ex-gambler was getting along. He found Dodge in a small store behind a counter with just one bushel of oysters dumped on it. Customer came in, called for half a dozen Shrewsbury oysters. Dodge took and opened the oysters from the only pile on the counter. Another customer came in, called for Blue Points. Dodge took them from the same pile of oysters. Another entered and asked for Saddle Rocks. The old gambler took them from the same lot. Charlie Backus could not stand it any more. He blurted out, "Gee, old man, you can still tell them by the backs, can't you?" That's a great story. I've never heard that story before. That's a great story. In his book, Dumont suggests about the end men, and I'm changing a few of the words here to avoid very offensive terminology. In rehearsing the gags with the end men, be careful to impress upon them the necessity of selecting those of a varied nature in order to avoid similarity of subjects. One end man may represent the enlightened, sarcastic end man. Another, the dense fellow, jolly but ignorant. Still another, the imitative or declamatory end man, whose forte seems to be poetry or recitations. Then again, you can have a sleepy, blundering fellow mispronouncing words, totally at sea concerning etiquette or history. There's material enough in this book to suit all. Do not use dialect, nor allow it to be used, as it spoils the stories, and is often unintelligible to the audience. It is for this reason that the gags, etc., have not been written in dialect form. Look at this. He's saying, don't use dialect. People completely ignored him. Here is a typical interlocutor end man exchange. It's called A Ship is Like a Woman. End. Did you know that I was one of the very first volunteers that went off to Cuba? Middle. Army or Navy? End. Navy. I didn't want any of that Army beef. Mid. Were you on a gunboat or a man of war? End. I was on a woman of war. Mid. You mean man of war? End. I mean woman of war. Now, suppose you saw a vessel approaching, decorated with flags. How would you express admiration? I would say she was a magnificent craft. There you go. How can a she be a he? Therefore, it must be a woman of war. Now a ship is just like a woman, for she has bows and a waist. It takes a man to manage her. A ship is like a woman, for it brings news from abroad. She always makes up to appear. She runs after a smack. She's ridiculous when in the company of small boys. That's a bad pun there. She's sometimes in company with a man of war. And last of all, a woman is like a ship, because the rigging costs more than the hull. Dumont also shares a story about thespians and false notions. A few of the superstitions handed down from the old days still survive, although we do not generally admit it. For instance, no one wished to occupy room 13. In many hotels or dressing rooms, the number is omitted. It was very unlucky to open an umbrella in a theater. It was considered unlucky to walk under a ladder. I've seen an entire troupe, band and all, while parading on the sidewalk, suddenly come to a ladder. The entire troupe would circle out into the muddy street around the ladder and back onto the sidewalk again. If you bragged of your health or any anticipated pleasure, you had to knock on wood. The most dreaded person was a Jonah. Old-timers firmly believed in them. Woe to the musician who joined the show and displayed a yellow clarinet. Bad business would overtake the show. The Jonah had to be gotten rid of. A cross-eyed man, a peculiar hat, or an ancient carpet bag was a Jonah. Some poor devils had the reputation of being one and were always blamed for the poor business and accordingly had to be dismissed. If you saw a wagon loaded with barrels, that was a good sign. You'd have a good house that night. Oh, it was 7 years bad luck to break a looking glass in the old-time Opry House. At one point, it became common for people backstage to shout Holmes when a mistake occurred. The origin of this quirk could be traced back to an account by Frank. According to Dumont, the cry originated with Edwin Holmes, a minstrel performer known among his peers for his well-intentioned but frequent blunders. Holmes' mishaps ranged from upending water pails in the dressing room to accidentally stepping on his own high hat. More than once, a crash or a commotion backstage would prompt a chorus of Holmes from his fellow performers. A standout moment was when Holmes was tasked with watching over a stage paper trap door during a skating sequence. He enthusiastically warned everyone away from the potential trap. Now, despite his endeavors to keep everyone out of harm's way, Holmes himself fell through the trap door and was discovered dazed but unharmed under the stage after the curtain fell. The association of this name with onstage and backstage pratfalls became so pronounced that Holmes evolved into a kind of affectionate ribbing, a byword for comic mistakes among his minstrel colleagues. Dumont dedicates an entire chapter to the art of blacking up. Here are some excerpts. What is that you're putting on your face? Is it black paint? No, indeed. It is burnt cork, a very simple preparation, but nothing has ever been invented to take its place. First, we get a lot of champagne corks, or remnants of cork, from a corkstopper factory. Put these in an old tin pail that serves as a furnace, and we set them on fire. When they've been thoroughly burned, we crush them, reduce them to a powder by hand, and then moisten the powder with water, run it through a small paint mill, and grind it thin. Then we place the paste thus made into tin boxes, and it's ready for use. You moisten with a little water the quantity you need as you're applying it to your face. We do not mix anything with it, although I have seen various recipes calling for Vaseline and other ingredients. Okay, I went to check. Yes, there was a brand of petroleum jelly named Vaseline, which was available in the 1890s. Now, how's it applied? Well, you take some into the palm of your left hand, rub it over the palms as if to wash your face, and then smear it all over your features as if you're applying a cosmetic. Carefully apply it around the eyes and about the lips. Oh, do you paint the lips red? No, sir. When you've applied the cork and left the lips in the natural condition, they'll appear red to the audience. Comedians leave a whiter white margin all around the lips. This will give the appearance of a large mouth and then will look red to the spectator. Having blackened my features, I now take my sponge and wipe the palms of both hands. This is for a double reason. It represents the real color of the colored man's hand. At the same time, cleans that portion of the hands for the remainder of the makeup for the stage. Thus you can handle the white vest, the bosom of shirt, collars, and ties without soiling them. Now you see, I am blacked up, and I take a small, soft brush to rub off the small particles of cork on my features to prevent them from falling on my white shirt and my white vest. I see. Now, sir, I put on my creamy white shirt after I am thoroughly blacked up. Then a paper or celluloid collar, a small black tie, some use a white tie, then my cuffs, either a paper or celluloid. Now I put on my white vest. Here, my clean hands do not soil the vest as I button it. Now I put on my swallowtail coat, with a flashy flower or boutonniere in its lapel, and I resemble a perfect Beau Brummel, do I not? You do, said the reporter. I understand that it is quite the fad for ladies to give minstrel entertainment. Yes, indeed, it is more popular than ever. Why, this season I furnished material for several entertainments first given by ladies only. How do they blacken up? Pretty much as we do. It wouldn't do for them to put on their complete costumes. No, they commence as we do, then attire themselves in their stage costumes. When they wear short sleeves, they do not blacken the arms, but wear long black silk or ordinary gloves. And by the way, sometimes we do not blacken the hands, but we will wear black gloves or white ones. I have my minstrel company blacken the hands, especially musicians who cannot wear gloves for such instruments as violins, flutes, clarinets, double bass, etc. Therefore, to look alike, we blacken our hands. The ladies, however, all wear black gloves except for the end men. Now, you see, I call them end men, even if they are ladies. One thing more, now that the cork is on, how do you get it off? Scrape it off with a knife? Mr. Dumont laughed, of course, at the scraping part. I just removed all my finery, and also the makeup shirt. And with a sponge and a cake of soap, I go at it. I make a good lather, smear it over my face, and then with the sponge well soaped, I go over the face and the neck, and presto, the cork has almost vanished. No hard rubbing is necessary. Plenty of lather and sponge. And here he makes a totally unexpected derogatory remark that caught me by surprise. I will not repeat it. If you want to read what he said, you can go get a copy of the book. You can download it from archive.org. And by this time, Mr. Dumont and his troupe were ready, and they descended to the stage. I heard the bell ring, and the curtain arose upon the handsome circle of minstrels. The interlocutors said, "Be seated, gentlemen." This book, Dumont's book, did not fundamentally change the nature of minstrelsy or challenge its problematic elements. It did help to codify and preserve the tradition and ensure its continued popularity for many years to come. So it extended the life of minstrelsy. It made it easier for new generations to replicate and participate in the form. But it did not reform or modernize the content to address growing criticisms or evolving social attitudes. Frank Dumont's career spanned the era when blackface minstrelsy, which had its roots in the decade that he was born, was the dominant form of American entertainment, if not the dominant form. There was a decline in popularity after the Civil War as other forms of entertainment became available, but minstrelsy remained prevalent in Philadelphia into the late 20th century and past. Eventually, African-American minstrel troupes became increasingly more common, and they earned success and acclaim during Reconstruction. But even those troupes of black performers were managed by whites. Dumont continued to perform and manage white minstrel troupes until his death while on duty at the post office on St. Patrick's Day of 1919, just at the tail end of the influenza epidemic that took the lives of nearly 700,000 Americans and more than 50 million people worldwide. The curtain had risen on the matinee performance. The interlocutor had invited the gentlemen to be seated when a late customer dashed up to the box office only to find the theater owner slumped over. A doctor was summoned. Frank Dumont was dead at age 71. He's buried with his parents in an unmarked grave in the X section of Laurel Hill East. His estate of $30,000, far less than many people anticipated, was left entirely to his second wife, Nellie, who outlived him by 20 years. When minstrel shows were predominant, they were not the only form of entertainment available. Americans also attended lectures, circuses, opera performances, theatrical plays, until vaudeville acts became more popular later in the century and eventually replaced minstrelsy. But the unique blend of music, comedy, and spectacle that was found in minstrel shows made them especially appealing and widespread compared to other forms of available entertainment. Many of Philadelphians' first theater experience was in attending a minstrel show. Dumont's Theater became a vaudeville house. Then it got into burlesque, as did the 11th Street Opera House. Dumont's burned down in 1929. Examples of blackface and minstrelsy still exist in the 21st century. Many movies and TV shows continue to rely on exaggerated, one-dimensional depictions of black characters. The sassy black friend, the thug, the comic relief, the magical Negro tropes. These echo the simplistic and derogatory characterizations that were seen in minstrel shows. They do not always involve blackface, but the use of such stereotypes can be seen as a continuation of minstrel traditions. Digital blackface, non-black social media users that employ GIFs, memos, language that exaggerate black expressions and behaviors. This phenomenon has been criticized as a modern form of minstrel performance, where blackness is appropriated for comedic or expressive purposes detached from real black experiences. If you want to squirm, American movie maker Spike Lee tackled the subject of blackface head-on in his 2000 movie Bamboozled. There are snippets of it on YouTube for free. The segments to watch feature Tommy Davidson and Savion Glover in jaw-dropping performances as blackface performers on a television minstrel show. What you will get is sort of a cross between the producer's Springtime for Hitler and Howard Beale in Network attending a revival session together. You will probably have a very hard time watching that segment straight through. I encourage you to do so. Bamboozled on YouTube. James Jimmy Bland, 1854-1911. From minstrelsy to mummery. He is not at Laurel Hill. Quick, what's the name of your state song? 48 of the 50 United States have one or more state songs. Tennessee has 14. New Jersey and Maryland have none. The anthem is selected by each state legislature as a symbol of that state. Now, some states have songs you know. Yankee Doodle for Connecticut, You Are My Sunshine, Louisiana, Rocky Top, Tennessee, and Home on the Range, Kansas. A few are popular standards. Oklahoma, from the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical of the same name. Hoagie Carmichael's Georgia on My Mind. Tennessee Waltz, written by Julius Kaczynski, better known as Pee Wee King. Missouri Waltz and On the Banks of the Wabash Far Away. Many others are much less well known, especially outside the state. Two individuals have written or co-written state songs for two different states. Stephen Foster wrote the music and lyrics for My Old Kentucky Home, which was adopted by Kentucky in 1928, and Old Folks at Home, better known as Swanee River or Sewanee River, adopted by Florida in 1935. The second composer, John Denver. He wrote the lyrics and co-wrote the music for Rocky Mountain High, which was adopted by Colorado in 2007, as one of the state's 2 official state songs, and John Denver co-wrote both the lyrics and the music for Take Me Home, Country Roads, adopted by West Virginia in 2014 as one of 4 official state songs. If you said Woody Guthrie, you were close. Arlo's dad wrote or co-wrote 2 state folk songs, Roll On, Columbia, Roll On for Washington and Oklahoma Hills in Oklahoma. But they have a separate status from the official state song of both states. And of course, Woody Guthrie wrote the unofficial national anthem for the United States, This Land Is Your Land. If you, like me, are in Pennsylvania, our state anthem begins, or perhaps I should say our Commonwealth anthem begins, Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania, mighty is your name, steeped in glory and tradition, object of acclaim, where brave men fought the foe of freedom, tyranny decried, till the bell of independence filled the countryside. I'm surprised I didn't say toll the bell of independence and something. State songs are rarely intended to be political, but in 1970, a newly elected state senator in Virginia used his first speech on the floor to protest his state's official song. Lawrence Douglas Wilder, a 39-year-old lawyer who had been named for 2 African-American heroes, Paul Laurence Dunbar and Frederick Douglass, and whose grandparents had been enslaved, gave his maiden speech in the Senate during Virginia's first official Black History Month. His topic was the lyrics of the state song. He recited them in front of his fellow legislators. Carry me back to old Virginia. There's where the cotton and corn and taters grow. There's where the birds warble sweet in the springtime. There's where this old darky's heart am long to go. There's where I labored so hard for old Massa, day after day in the field of yellow corn. No place on earth do I love more sincerely than old Virginia, the state where I was born. It did take several years to happen, but that song is no longer the state song of Virginia. Douglas Wilder led the charge. He later rose to be elected the first black governor of the state. Doug Wilder turns 95 in January of 2026. The song that he protested had music and lyrics written by James A. Bland, a free black man, born to a free black man in Flushing, New York in 1854. James's father was educated at Oberlin College and worked as an insurance agent, which gave the young James access to intellectual circles and opportunities. Soon after the end of the Civil War, the Blands moved to Washington, D.C., where James's father earned a law degree at Howard University and became the first African American in the United States Patent Office. Bland learned how to play the banjo and guitar, and he started to compose his first songs at an early age. By the time he turned 14, he was singing professionally. He did attend Howard University in Washington, D.C., like his father. The school had opened in 1867, but he left prior to graduation to perform on the stage. It was while he was at Howard University that he met 2 people destined to change his life. Manny Friend became his girlfriend, and Professor White, an old black man with snow-white hair who recognized Bland's God-given musical talents, taught him how to write songs and music. And one night, while he was playing and singing in Lafayette Park, to Manny, Mr. John Ford, owner of Ford's Theater, saw him and offered to introduce Jimmy to George Primrose, one of the great white minstrel men of the time. The introduction to Primrose was delayed by a trip to Manny's birthplace in Tidewater, Virginia, which is on Judge White's plantation on the James River, between Charles City and Williamsburg. Here, while James Bland and Manny Friend were sitting on the banks of the James, Jimmy composed Carry Me Back to Old Virginia, Manny wrote the words down for him as he played and sang it. Now, when he returned to Washington, Mr. Ford introduced Jimmy Bland to George Primrose of Primrose and West. And with this one song, Carry Me Back to Old Virginia, Jimmy, now age 19, made a big hit with Primrose and Billy West. And within a week, they opened their new show in Baltimore. Tom Harvey, owner of the then famous Harvey's Restaurant in Washington, D.C., had Jimmy play and sing his composition in the evening by the moonlight for the Canvasback Club. Now it's called the Gridiron Club, that met at his restaurant. President Grover Cleveland and General Robert E. Lee were both members, and they were present for the affair. They heard Jimmy Bland sing. Jimmy realized limitations of a 4-string banjo, so he added a 5th string to the banjo. It became known as the Bland banjo. In his middle 20s, Jimmy worked the minstrel shows and eventually joined Colonel Jack Harvey's minstrel troupe and toured the United States. In 1881, Bland's salary was $10,000 a year, purportedly the highest ever paid a minstrel man. Then Bland and Harvey's minstrel went to Europe, became an overnight sensation. Jimmy gave a command performance at Buckingham Palace before Queen Victoria and the Prince of Wales. Jimmy liked Europe. He stayed on when the troupe left. He performed solo to turn away crowds in both England and the continent for the next 20 years, and he became something of an exotic matinee idol. German journalist Hans Wunderlich said that before the turn of the century, only 3 American composers made an appreciable dent in the German consciousness: John Philip Sousa, James A. Bland, and Stephen Foster. Bland is rightly regarded as the spiritual heir to Foster, and his songs have at times been misattributed to the white composer, who, like him, was from the North. Bland's songwriting talent and singing so overshadowed his comic abilities that very little has been written about the latter. Most everything concentrates on his songwriting. But one contemporary comedian describes him as, quote, a great comedian as well as composer. When he walked on stage to do his specialty, no one knew just what he was going to say. He followed no set routine, yet could convulse an audience with his handling of whatever crossed his mind. Others referred to him as a refined comedian. Now, when you examine James Bland's legacy, it is essential to, once again, address the difficult history of American minstrelsy and a popular music genre then called coon songs. And yes, I winced when I said that. A term that now, of course, is understood as a quite offensive racial slur. These compositions were popular at the time. They were rooted in stereotypes that reinforced racism. As a black composer who navigated an industry that simultaneously constrained and took advantage of black artists, Bland's experience is inherently complex. An honest assessment of this period enables a deeper understanding of the obstacles faced by black musicians and underscores the necessity of acknowledging the past to foster a more inclusive future. To avoid stumbling over cultural errors that I, as a white male boomer, am subject, I am going to quote from culture critic Mel Watkins' 1994 tome, On the Real Side, Black Minstrelsy to Vaudeville. Quote, Bland remains a controversial figure in black entertainment history. He wrote as many as 700 songs during his lifetime and was known among his peers as the Black Stephen Foster. At the time, it was common practice for writers to sell songs outright to publishing companies and other entertainers. Consequently, many of his songs were attributed to other composers. Although the music historian Eileen Southern contends that Bland's, quote, unpretentious sentimental songs were lightly syncopated and reflected the influence of the folk songs he heard sung by ex-slaves in Washington, D.C., unquote, Many musicologists argue that Bland's music reflects little or no influence from genuine black folk song. Generally, their form and content are indistinguishable from the raft of degrading, stereotype-ridden minstrel songs that were turned out by white composers. The familiar Carry Me Back to Old Virginia, for instance, is a paean to a mythical antebellum South where Massa and Missus awaited their loyal servant, and even after their deaths, quote, the old darkey's heart am long to go, end quote. In the Evening by the Moonlight reiterates the theme of darkies hoping to be reunited with Massa and Missus since everything was then so merry, gay, and bright. Ironically, Bland, like many composers of this genre of song, had never witnessed or experienced the reality of slavery. One biographer suggests that Bland absorbed his knowledge of slavery from ex-slaves who worked and lived in Washington after emancipation. But more likely, Bland was mimicking the sentiments and working within a musical form that was inspired primarily by the mythology of the minstrel stage and not by the beautiful melodies of his own people. As musicologist Sam Dennison aptly puts it, what is indisputable is Bland's genius in imitating white song types. And he did so with amazing regularity and consistency. The demeaning character of his songs aside, Jimmy Bland was the most prolific and famous black composer of the minstrel period, as well as one of its most successful and influential performers. The music industry itself dictated the type of songs that would be published, and faced with a dilemma of succeeding personally at the expense of publicly denigrating blacks or not being published at all, James Bland opted for success. Although they are not remembered as much as his plantation songs, Jimmy Bland did write anti-slavery songs. In 1880, he wrote and performed Go carry the news to Sister Hannah, slavery chains am broke at last, and tell her to tell to sweet Johanna, slavery chains am broke at last. In another song, Way Up Yonder, he sings, Soon this darky will be going way up yonder, for my heart with joy am flowing, I will meet you there. Tell them I am feeling splendid way up yonder, and my golden shoes are mended, I will meet you there. The concept of golden shoes holds diverse meanings across various cultural, religious, and artistic contexts, often associated with luxury, celebration, spiritual aspirations, folklore. Golden shoes have captured the imagination of societies worldwide. In some black cultures, the golden slippers represent the reward for a virtuous life, a metaphor for the joys of the afterlife. For enslaved people and their descendants, the symbolism of receiving golden slippers in the next life was their source of hope and comfort. James Bland addressed the subject of metallic footwear on more than one occasion. Upon his return to Philadelphia, he was employed by Frank Dumont's Minstrels, where one of his prominent performances featured a song that he composed in 1879. This composition achieved significant commercial success. It sold more than 100,000 copies in its first year of publication. It was based on an earlier spiritual called simply Golden Slippers. That features the lyrics, Golden slippers I'm bound to wear to outshine the glittering sun. Oh, yes, 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 my Lord, I'm going to join the heavenly choir. Yes, 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 my Lord, soldier of the cross. The new song went, Oh, my old banjo hangs on the wall, case it ain't been tuned since way last fall. But the darks all say we will have a good time when we ride up in the chariot in the morn. Dar's old brother Ben and sister Luce, they will telegraph the news to Uncle Bacco Juice. What a great camp meeting there will be that day when we ride up in the chariot in the morn. And then came the verse, Oh, them golden slippers. Now, Frank Dumont's nephew, Charlie, heard this song, probably as he worked backstage at his uncle's theater. He thought that this might be a good song for a new group of mummers that he had recently joined. It may have been taken to them as early as 1905. That's only 4 years after the first official Mummers Parade had occurred. Mummers had been marching for centuries, literally for centuries, but the first official sponsored parade wasn't until 1901. It means James Bland was still alive in 1905 and might have actually heard the Mummers play this song. On the other hand, it's possible it wasn't introduced to the group until as late as 1920. Whenever, it soon spread. It was slow starting, but pretty soon all of the string bands had pretty much adopted "O Dem Golden Slippers" as their theme song. Now, Bland's career ultimately brought him unanticipated difficulties. Back in the United States, he was said to have purchased the largest diamond ever worn, probably by a colored person, a massive 4.5-carat stone. But the demise of racist minstrelsy also heralded the demise of James Bland's career, as his art form was superseded by vaudeville and then ragtime. He found himself redundant and impoverished, if not destitute. He tried his hand at writing a full-blown musical, The Sporting Girl. It was not a success. After he wrote 18 songs for it, he sold the whole thing for $25. Who knows what happened to that? As his life and career unraveled, Bland reportedly turned to alcohol. U.B. Blake recalled a final meeting that hinted at Bland's despair and unreliability before his death, which came from tuberculosis in 1911. Bland was staying at a flop house at 10th and Wood in Philadelphia. His friends tried to raise the $25 necessary for a funeral and burial, but $6 was the best they could do. And his body was almost sent to the medical examiners for final placement in a potter's field or, God forbid, a medical school anatomy laboratory. But the funeral director chosen to prepare the body was William H. Battersby, and he recognized Jimmy Bland, and he arranged for his burial at Marion Memorial Park on Rock Hill Road in Bala. Now, Battersby is interred not that far away. He's interred at Laurel Hill West in the Bryn Mawr section. Marion Memorial Cemetery, about a mile up Belmont from Laurel Hill West. It was open in the 1890s as an inexpensive alternative to the other suburban cemeteries that were springing up. And from the day it opened, it welcomed all ethnic groups and people of all shades. Now, in the decades that followed his death, James Bland was pretty much forgotten. His songs remained popular, but they were attributed to other writers, and a lot of them were actually attributed to Stephen Foster. His 700 songs had been written before the formation of the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, ASCAP. ASCAP came along in the early 1900s. That means he received only a fraction of the money that they produced. Remember, the sheet music for "O Them Golden Slippers" sold 1 million copies. And it's doubtful that Bland got more than a few dollars of that. Not only that, most of his songs were published under the names of the white minstrel performers that he had sold them to. So for 28 years, James Bland lay on an unmarked grave in a cemetery that was nearly abandoned. And in 1939, the editor of the Etude magazine located the grave with the help of Bland's sister, who was then in her 80s. Etude, you've heard about before, if you're a long-time podcast listener. Founded in 1883 by Theodore Presser, who's interred at Laurel Hill West. And that was Biographical Bytes from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories number 4, that talked about Theodore Presser. Now, Jimmy Bland's story may have ended there, except for the enduring popularity of 2 of his compositions. You know which ones they are. Bland's star rose in 1940 when the state of Virginia adopted "Carry Me Back to Old Virginny" as its official state song. and eventually this piece of music sold more than 10 million copies of sheet music. In 1946, the Virginia Lions Club raised enough money to erect a proper stone on his poison ivy-covered grave site. There was a ceremony that occurred during the annual Lions Club International Convention. That year was at the Bellevue Stratford in Center City. Article in the newspaper. James A. Bland, Negro composer of that immortal piece, now the official song of the state of Virginia, will be fittingly memorialized on Monday, July 15th, 1946 at 4 p.m., when the governors of 2 states will head a delegation of distinguished officials of the Lions International Association and the Lions Club of Virginia in this assemblage at his grave in Philadelphia. The governors will be William M. Tuck of Virginia and Edward S. Martin of Pennsylvania. The group will gather in the suburban Marion Cemetery and dedicate a slab of granite which will forever mark the spot under which for 35 years have rested the remains of the celebrated composer of Carry Me Back to Old Virginia and 600 other heart-tugging songs, including In the Evening by the Moonlight and Oh, Dem Golden Slippers. The dedication will culminate a movement started by the Virginia Lions Club back in 1941, but interrupted by 4 years of war. It will bring this 19th century Negro minstrel still closer to thousands of his own race who have been captivated by the sweet song's long-played sentimental tribute. In 1948, a Bland Music Foundation was founded in Virginia to provide music scholarships for the gifted youth of Virginia. Many years later, in 1986, James A. Bland got an official blue and yellow Pennsylvania historical marker at his grave. That is how I first encountered him. I live, about a mile or two from his final resting place, and I would pass it often when I was walking the dog. James Bland was inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 1970. There's a housing project in Queens, New York, that's named for him. Now, in the 21st century, Philadelphia mummers have not forgotten or neglected the man who wrote their theme song. Every year, in the week before the shooters take to the streets of Philadelphia to strut and strum, a handful make their way from South Philadelphia to the suburban green stretch of Marion Memorial Park. There they drive down James A. Bland Road. Elsewhere, in this garden of stone, they could pay their respects to Norristown native and maybe the finest jazz organist who ever lived, Jimmy Smith. Or they could wander over to the stone of fabled bluesman Nehemiah Skip James and hum a few bars of his classic Devil Got My Woman. But instead, they head straight to the grave of James Bland, where they silently pray and pay their respects. Today, James Bland is recognized as one of America's great popular songwriters. He has been criticized for writing nostalgic Negro songs about happy darkies on the plantation, urban dandies, and overdressed religious celebrants. But his songs were never nasty or degrading, and his best remain among the nation's most beloved and enduring popular songs. Each New Year's Day, white, working-class Philadelphians dress up in lavish costumes and strut up Broad Street singing their favorite songs. Before the 1960s, many did so in the traditional blackface of the minstrel stage. The crossover from minstrelsy to mummery is there. There's no denying it. And of course, the official theme song of the Mummers Parade, Oh Dem Golden Slippers, is a song that the minstrel James Bland published in 1879. In the January 1st, 2026 episode of All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 81, it's a handful of people celebrating their 200th birthday. Two of them you already know, Martha Costin and Joseph Wharton. Add to that District Attorney Henry Shell Hagert, who served as prosecuting attorney in the trial of Frank Kelly for the murder of Octavius Cato. Cabinet maker Daniel Pabst, credited with some of the most extraordinary custom interiors and handcrafted furniture in the United States. Physician Thomas Hewson Beach, and undertaker Samuel Patch Frankenfield, whose 7 sons also became undertakers. Mid-January's Biographical Bytes from Bala, Laurel Hill West Stories, will be about a Laurel Hill West resident with a centenary birth, Mary Scarpone Costanza, who spent much of her career collecting and interpreting art that was produced by victims of the Holocaust. For upcoming activities and tours, go to the website, laurelhillphl.com/events. Remind you that All Bones Considered has been chosen as the best Philadelphia history podcast, and we are up to more than 80,000 downloads right now. The book, 52 Women, All Bones Considered, 52 Laurel Hill Women, available from the cemetery, gift shop, online, or you can order it from Amazon. I haven't seen it in any local bookstores yet. It's starting to make it into the libraries, though. If you want a signed copy, personal signed copy, just email me, and I'll let you know how to do that. jrlexjr1947@gmail.com. And don't forget, last-minute Christmas shopping. There is an author event at Phoenixville Library on December 18th. If you want to head out to Phoenixville and hear what I have to say about the book. Who would that be? That's All Bones Considered Biographical Bytes from Bala are mostly research, written, narrated, and produced by me, Joe Lex, retired professor of emergency medicine from Temple University, volunteer tour guide, volunteer podcaster for both cemeteries. Email again, jrlexjr1947@gmail.com. The theme song, Names at Peace, is by local artist James Harrow. And maybe I will see you on a tour. Stay safe, stay well. And the bibliography for Biographical Bytes is usually short. Boy, that is not the case this time. This is a long bibliography, so be prepared. Stay safe, stay well, stay above ground. I've got articles here that go all the way back to 1867. I found one called Stephen C. Foster and Negro Minstrelsy in Atlantic from November of 1867, pages 608 through, what is this, about 10 pages? Yeah, through 616. And then there's an article called 3 Years as a Negro Minstrel. This is also from the Atlantic, July 1869, pages 71 through 85. Terrific book I got for free from archive.org. It's an encyclopedia. It's Monarchs of Minstrelsy from Daddy Rice to date. The date in this case is 1911. It's by Edward Leroy Rice, author of 1,000 Men of Minstrelsy and One Woman, Minstrelsy That Was and Is, A Ramble Among the Minstrels, etc. This is Kenny Publishing Company on North William Street in New York City. But as I say, it's available for free to download from archive.org. I did not get to include this, but I just saved this article because it is so bizarre. It's out of the Philadelphia Inquirer, May 13th, 1916. Are you ready for this? Blind schools pupils give minstrel show. The Overbrook School for the Blind had a minstrel show. They made blind kids, blind white kids, black up and perform. Very strange. The Darker Image, American Negro Minstrelsy Through the Historian's Lens. Author is George F. Rehin, R-E-H-I-N. Journal of American Studies, December 1975, Volume 9, Number 3, pages 365 to 373. The Internationalization of American Popular Culture in the 19th Century, The Case of the Minstrel Show. The author is Richard Waterhouse. It's from the Australasian Journal of American Studies, July 1985, Volume 4, Number 1, pages 1 through 11. The Seeming Counterfeit, Racial Politics and Early Blackface Minstrelsy, Eric Lott. American Quarterly, June 1991, volume 43, number 2, pages 223 to 254. Love and Theft, The Racial Unconscious of Blackface Minstrelsy, also by Eric Lott. This is Representations, Summer 1992, number 39, pages 23 to 50. Democracy and Burnt Cork, The End of Blackface, The Beginning of Civil Rights. Michael Rogan, Representations, September 1994, number 46, pages 1 through 34. Humor and Ethnic Stereotypes in Vaudeville and Burlesque, Lawrence E. Mintz. Melus, M-E-L-U-S, Winter, 1996, volume 21, number 4, Ethnic Humor, pages 19 to 28. Melus is the multi-ethnic literature of the United States. The Carnivalizing of Race, Rachel Sussman. Ethno 4, 2001, volume 14, number 2, Masquerades, pages 79 to 88. White Collars and Blackface, Race and Leisure Among Clerical and Sales Workers in Early 20th Century Philadelphia, by Jerome P. Jalopera. That's B-J-E-L Opera, O-P-E-R-A, all one word. This is a terrific article. This, what the author did was go back to the in-house publications of Strawbridge and Clothier and talk about the minstrel shows that the employees used to do every year. It's from the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, July 2002, volume 126, number 3, pages 471 to 490. The Negro Excursions, Recreational Outings Among Philadelphia African Americans, 1876-1926. Brian E. Allnut, the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, volume 129, number 1, January 2005, pages 73 to 104. The Folly of Racism, Enslaving Blackface and the Natural Fool Tradition, Robert Hornback. Medieval and Renaissance Drama in England, 2007, volume 20, pages 46 to 84. Falling Back into History, The Uncanny Trauma of Blackface Minstrelsy in Spike Lee's Bamboozled. Gregory Lasky, Callaloo, Fall, 2010, volume 33, number 4, pages 1093 to 1115. Can American popular vocal music escape the legacy of blackface minstrelsy? Lee B. Brown, The Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism, Winter 2013, volume 71, number 1, special issue, Songs and Singing, Winter 2013, pages 91 to 100. How Watermelons Became Black, William R. Black, Journal of the Civil War Era, volume 8, number 1, March 2018, pages 64 to 86. This is a phenomenal article. How did watermelons were not identified with a particular ethnic group until after the Civil War. And finally, for the introduction, Oriental Frolics and Racial Uplift in the Early African American Musical. The book title is Oriental Black and White, subtitle The Formation of Racial Habits in American Theater, and that's by Joseph Lee. 2022. Which chapter is this? This is chapter 8, pages 165 through 190. For Carncross and Dixey, it is newspaper articles, some of the things I already referred to, of course, but also specific newspaper articles about Carncross and Dixey. The version of Dixey we heard was by Vernon Dalhart. As far as Frank Dumont, I mentioned the Whitmark Amateur Minstrel Guide and Burke Cork Encyclopedia, which, as I said, is available from archive.org. It's copyrighted in 1899 by M. Whitmark and Sons, all rights reserved, entered at Stationers' Hall, London, England. For James Bland, there's an article called James A. Bland, Pioneer Black Songwriter, by William R. Hullfish. It's from Black Music Research Journal, 1987, Volume 7, pages 1 through 33, published by the Center for Black Music Research. Also, On the Real Side, Laughing Lion and Signifying, the underground tradition of African-American humor that transformed American culture from slavery to Richard Pryor, by Mel Watkins. This is Simon & Schuster, 1994, especially the chapter on minstrels. And then I found something called Haunted City, 3 Centuries of Racial Impersonation in Philadelphia, by Christian Ducombe. This looks like it was privately printed. Let's see if there is a printer for it. University of Michigan Press. I was wrong. This is for University of Michigan Press, Ann Arbor, 2017. But this had a lot of good information about James Bland in it. I was surprised. So that's it. As I said, a lot of material in the bibliography this month. Thank you for listening. This was longer than I intended, as has been happening a lot lately. This was supposed to be a simple little 45-minute podcast, and it exploded into about 2 hours worth, if not more. So I hope you enjoy it, and believe it or not, come back in 2 weeks. I'll have some more stuff for you. But I hope you enjoy this one. Stay safe, stay well, stay above ground.